Hey folks, in this video I'm going to be reviewing another game submitted via our Patreon, and this one comes from Dan, aka Sriracha here, who is playing white. And this game features a really interesting, very trendy line of the Najdorf, specifically the English attack, that I think would be really useful to discuss. In this game, Dan playing white does go for the typical English attack, as we see out of the opening here with e4, c5. Knight f3, d6, and black plays the Najdorf Sicilian, of course, very common these days. White goes for bishop e3, e5, knight b3, and in this game, black opts for, nowadays, the pretty popular line h5. So I remember this line became really popular many years ago, and it was just kind of this like newfangled way of treating the English attack, where black just stops white from doing what they kind of want, which is to play g4, and instead black plays this move early on, keeps the king in the center for a while, and then looks for the right moment later on to castle. And I remember people kind of treated this line as if it was kind of like good for its surprise value, but objectively kind of dubious. But now with the latest engines, I think these lines are being shown to be just as playable as some of the main lines. So it's become a very serious weapon that's good not just for its surprise value, but maybe just in general, just an interesting way for black to treat this position. And this is actually one that I've recommended before on this channel to especially lower rated players kind of playing the Najdorf. I think this is kind of a cool way for black to play because it stops white again from their kind of main plan in the position, and a lot of English attack players, upon their first or second time seeing this type of play for black, they really get lost. They don't know what to do because they're only used to this one plan of playing g4, h4 on the king side. Nowadays, the theory has developed quite a bit, and I'm by no means a Najdorf expert, so I had to do quite a bit of research to record this video. But I think I found some interesting games. I checked the database and looked at what some of the top guys have been playing, and I think I found some interesting stuff. So this is kind of a key tabia for this line, where white can choose from several different ways of playing it, and white can also choose to play it in a more strategic or positional way, or in a more, let's say, aggressive and dynamic way. In the game, white plays a4, which I would say is going more of a positional route, because generally what white seems to do in this kind of structure is play knight d5 at some point. Black will take on d5 either with the bishop or with the knight, kind of depending, and then white often recaptures with the pawn. And generally we're taught that you don't really want to take back on d5 with the pawn in the Najdorf, but it is a thing. It is a thing that often does happen, and yeah, perfectly normal structure for white to play, where white is then going to be trying to use the queenside majority and playing for the c4, c5 break. So a4, this is one way to do it. It seems like nowadays knight d5, this is the main move if you want to treat this position in a very strategic way. So just playing for kind of like a small long-term positional plus. Typically here black takes with the knight, goes bishop f5, white plays bishop e2, and then the plan is to castle and push c4 and bring the rooks to the c file and eventually play for this c5 break. And I think it's actually quite a reasonable approach for white. Again, the game is a little bit more positional, not as tactical. If you wanted to be a bit more aggressive as white, I think the move to choose would be queenside castling. And there's a couple different ways the game can go here, but a couple interesting ideas I just want to point out in this position. Typically black goes knight d7, and white follows king b1, very useful move. And here black kind of has a choice between rook c8 and b5, and both of these moves I think have their advantages and disadvantages. I think rook c8 is kind of the classic move that most Najdorf players play. And here I feel like a good setup for white is to put the bishop on d3, put this pawn on h3, so we're kind of intending to go g4 if allowed. h3 will likely provoke black to play h4, and then I think white should be actually playing in the center here with f4 and rook he1. There have been some games here, but as far as I remember, this is a pretty annoying plan for black to deal with. Because look, black stopped g4, but black's position is not perfect. At some point black is going to have to castle, and the h-pawn will be a liability. If black just leaves the king in the center forever, well, f4, rook he1, white's eventually going to open everything up. And yeah, it's not so easy for black to play with the king on e8. So I think this is quite an interesting way for white to handle the position in case of rook c8. And if black plays b5, either here or in other positions, really important idea that white should know, very thematic for these kinds of positions, is that after the knight comes to d5 and the pawn recaptures on d5, white is then going to be controlling the c6 square. So the key idea that white needs to look out for in the future structure like that is to go knight to a5. So right away here, knight d5, I believe, is the main move. And there's actually a recent game between Aronian here and Van Forest as black, where black actually played knight takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop f5, and this is actually landing black in some immediate trouble. After knight a5, really strong move, white was already doing really well. So this move, very important to look out for when black has played b5 in this structure, and it makes a big difference. And with the knight coming to c6, a lot of times black really suffers in this kind of position. In this case, I think it worked out beautifully for white. Bishop d3, black traded, white takes with the c-pawn here, opening up the c-file for the rook. And after knight b6, Aronian just takes on b6 and leaves himself with this position, kind of a classic good knight versus bad bishop scenario. And he just had a huge advantage already in this position. So that was one way where things can already kind of nice example of how things can go wrong for black. I believe the main line is to take on d5 with the bishop here, and then to immediately play knight to b6, hitting this pawn and forcing white to give back the bishop pair. And then the theory runs takes, and once again we see this idea of knight a5. So this is really the critical move that white has to kind of keep in mind in these positions. It's knight a5 heading to c6. And yeah, I checked the theory out a little bit here. I mean, it's quite interesting. You can really go down the rabbit hole in these Najdorf lines, because there's a lot of correspondence games, especially in this position. And it seems like after rook to c8, it's not the most popular move, but if you turn on the engine in this position, it's going to strongly suggest the move c4. And this move actually hasn't really been tested in classical chess, but it's been played a lot from what I could tell in correspondence chess. So of course, the correspondence guys, as usual, are way ahead of the opening curve compared to everyone else. And yeah, very interesting idea here to play c4. The point is that when black, if black takes on c4, then black's a6 pawn is going to be weak in the future. This is just my human understanding. I'm sure the engines understand these positions much deeper. And yeah, I don't really know how to evaluate this. You know, of course, in correspondence chess, everything is often gets analyzed out to a draw. So this really takes, I think, more of a human evaluation and to decide whether this is a position that white wants to go into. And to me, it looks quite promising for white because we have the c6 square, we have this potential queenside majority, and yeah, the knight is coming back to a5 and eventually to c6. So maybe the engine can hold the position for black, but from white's point of view, definitely feels like there's quite a bit of play here. So yeah, there's lots of room to explore variations. I just wanted to give you guys a sense of how to just orient yourself a little bit in this kind of position. I also saw a really interesting game by Magnus where he played bishop e2 in this kind of key tabia, and this was against Ding Liren. And in that game, after knight d7, knight d5 was played. So again, typical maneuver knight d5, and it seems like this one is very common in all these h5 lines. Fighting for the light squares in the position because black has already kind of weakened themselves a little bit long term. So here after knight d5, black played bishop takes and played this move b6. Not necessarily a great move, but we can kind of understand it. Black is trying to stop knight a5, which is white's idea, whether black plays b5 or not. Actually, in this case, white can definitely follow up knight a5 and c4 and start kind of expanding on the queen side. And another kind of very typical idea then to push b4 and bring the knight back to b3 when we've already got b4 and helping us push c5 through. Because white has this queenside majority, and of course, once you get the structure, now it's all about pushing the queenside. So in the Magnus game after b6, he actually castles queenside, which was actually quite strong. Queen c7, king b1, as usual. Here, black decides to go b5. I guess he just couldn't figure out another way to get his counterplay going. And maybe that's why queenside castling is so strong in this position, because the only way for black to create counterplay is maybe to play b5, but now this allows the typical knight a5. So Magnus plays this one, knight b6 is played, white trades, queen takes, knight c6, bishop d8. and now c4 once again. So pretty thematic idea, c4, to break open the c-file. And I think white just had a really big advantage here. Black castled, white continues rook e1, and then he goes g4 here. Very, very strong. Actually, I'll just show two more moves just because this was really nice how this game played out. Takes bishop h4, and here Magnus just goes g5, just going straight ahead for the attack. The idea is that if black plays bishop takes e1, white throws a knight e7 check, the king is forced to the h-file, and then after queen takes here, it's pretty much unstoppable checkmate to this king. So g6, queen h4, and queen h6 mate, that knight on e7 is just killer. So really, really incredible game, and it shows if, players at the highest level can possibly lose this position in like 20 moves, and yeah, there's quite a bit of danger here for black. So even though it's quite an interesting line, white also has ways of posing black some serious problems if you keep this knight a5 idea in line and kind of all these themes on playing on the light squares. So going into the game, there's a couple of interesting moments in this middle game as well. We see a4, knight d7, a5, and white here takes a much more positional approach, castling kingside. Queen c7, black plays this, I think, very normally so far, and now rook fc1. And yeah, very logical move, preparing to play knight d5 in the future. And this is, again, white's idea, force to trade, take with the pawn on d5, and then the rook can be used to push the c-pawn. Black goes knight h5, white takes the opportunity to play knight d5 here, black takes, and now queen takes d5. And such an interesting moment because, like I mentioned earlier, generally, you're taught in the Sicilian that you do want to take back on d5 with a piece. In most cases, to kind of keep your outpost, you don't want to put your pawn there because then you block all of your pressure on the d-file. But I think this is one of those cases where white's pieces are all just kind of set up for this queenside advance, that e takes d5 is actually a little bit more logical here. And after queen takes d5, generally the idea, of taking back with a piece is that you want to put pressure on d6, but there's no pressure to really be had here. It's just going to take white way too many moves to get knight d2, knight c4, rook d1. Just kind of takes way too long, and by the time white does that, black is already kicking us with knight f6, right? So it's kind of never going to happen here for white. So here I think e takes d5 was definitely the right recapture, and then the idea would be to push c4. I took a little bit of a deeper look at this position, and to me, the problem for black is it's like not that easy for white to get c5 in, but it's also very easy for black to kind of blunder and allow it. So I'll show you what I mean, because I looked at some sample lines. I was thinking, let's say, for example, black castles here and tries to play f5. Well, here white will go c4. And if black plays f5 and is not careful, white's plan is to go rook c2, bring this rook to d1, and then to look for some c5 and d6 ideas. It's actually pretty uncomfortable for black. So I also considered maybe black goes like rook f8 here, rook c2, g6, rook d1, knight g7. And here pushing c5 would not be so great because black can go knight f5, and the rook on c2 is under attack, bishop on e3 also under heavy pressure here. But instead, if white just slows down with bishop to d3, it's a nice example of how the position is not so easy for black to play. Because again, one hasty move like f5 weakens all the light squares in the position. Now c5 all of a sudden works. dc, there's going to be d6 followed by bishop c4 check, and white is winning material. So I think black should be kind of reasonably okay in this position, but there is some kind of nice strategic venom that white can kind of play for. So yeah, in the game we see queen takes d5, and I think black should just immediately go knight f4 here right away and just fight for the dark squares. In the game we see black playing g5, which is very spirited, and I can kind of understand the idea. Black wants to recapture with the g-pawn, but I think this one was not right. I think the immediate knight f4 should have been played, because if white takes, black takes back. I get that the structure looks weak, but the more important thing here is that white is just getting killed on the dark squares. Now black wants to play h3, knight f6, and yeah, I think the game is definitely not over. White is still very much in the game. Maybe a move like h3 would be my choice. Otherwise, h3 from black is going to be way too annoying. And yeah, I think I'd probably take black here, but game continues. Nevertheless, I think this is what black should have done. After g5, white kind of ignores the threat of knight f4, but then plays knight d2, knight f4, and now white is forced to take it, and we get into this structure, which I think turns out just to be very, very pleasant for black. Just black's pieces end up much more active here, and white's king definitely ends up in a lot more danger. So what white needed to do was just completely ignore and actually play against the knight on f4. And what I mean by that is to pull the bishop back to f1, and then bring the queen back as well. So let's say bishop f1 to start, knight f4, and then queen somewhere, queen d1, queen d2. And the point is that black actually only has like one really good piece in the position, and this knight is dominated by white's bishop on f1. Actually not that easy for black to make progress here. White's next move is h3, just controlling the g4 square, not letting black break through. And if black goes h3 themselves, well now g3, the light squares don't feel as weak around white's king with this bishop nicely parked on f1. So I actually think white is doing just fine here. And then next is c4, and white will look for a chance to break with c5, open the position, and in the long run this light square bishop should actually be a pretty decent piece. So this is how white needed to handle the position. It's not easy to just let the knight live on f4, but at the same time it's like one active piece from black's point of view. Not really a whole lot white has to be worried about here, especially with this bishop on f1. This is a typical theme where the bishop really covers a lot of the squares that the knight can really attack us on. So after knight f4 takes, I think the game definitely turns into black's favor. Bishop c4, rook h7, black defends from the side, king f8. I think black should have just played h3 here, but yeah, not a huge deal. Knight c4, knight f6, finally we get h3, and yeah, now the position really gets very, very difficult for white because the king is just getting opened up, the rook on a1 ends up out of the game, and even though white played this rook fc1, was never able to get any kind of action with c4, c5. So yeah, the plans get a little bit mixed up here. Oddly enough, black doesn't win the game despite playing really, really well. d5, opening everything up, opening up bishop c5 check. Probably there was some time trouble, is my guess. This was a online classical game. Because after check, king f1, rook to g7, queen d3, it looks like it's totally over. But in this position, actually, the players end up repeating moves and making a draw. Kind of surprising, but turns out black in under 10 minutes here at this point, according to the notes, and was probably just stressed out from the time trouble. Of course, black is completely winning, as Dan points out in his notes. Maybe the simplest was to go rook f2 check, and then queen d7, where the queen is getting in, and yeah, white is just getting mated. Everything is collapsing. Another possibility would be to play e4, followed by f3 check, just opening everything up, getting the queen in. I think this would also just be totally devastating for white. But yeah, I understand sometimes when you're in time trouble, it's hard to find the right moves and keep your cool. So white got a little bit lucky here, but yeah, sometimes that happens in the heat of the battle. In any case, really interesting game. A lot of cool ideas in this one. So I hope you guys learned from it. I definitely learned a lot looking at this game myself and some of the high-level games that I mentioned earlier. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know in the comment section down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please make sure to do so. We really do appreciate it. All right, guys, hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.